The studio lights burned brighter than usual that night, casting long shadows across the set that gave everything an extra charge of tension. Rachel Maddow sat in her chair with her trademark seriousness, stacks of research papers spread out, like weapons ready to be deployed. This wasn't just another interview for her. This was supposed to be one of those iconic takedowns that MSNBC would replay for weeks, the kind of clip that cements reputations and spikes ratings. She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, her eyes glinting in anticipation. Opposite her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising star in the Democratic Party. At 43, Crockett carried herself with the kind of quiet poise that made you lean in before she even opened her mouth. Former trial lawyer, civil rights attorney, now Congresswoman from Texas, she had a reputation for bringing fire wherever she went. What most people didn't know yet was that she also had a knack for seizing the spotlight and refusing to let it go. Maddow thought she had the upper hand. She'd been preparing this segment for days, even extending airtime so she could corner Crockett about what she and her producers called progressive overreach. The plan was simple: show the audience that while progressive ideas might sound inspiring, they were politically toxic, a risk Democrats couldn't afford to take heading into the next election cycle. Maddow had done this countless times before. Guests came in confident. They left humbled. It was a familiar rhythm, and Rachel had mastered it. But something about Crockett's posture should have been her first warning. She didn't lean back, nervously like so many guests did. She didn't shuffle papers or sip water to calm her nerves. Instead, she sat upright, calm, almost relaxed, with the presence of someone who had walked into a courtroom knowing she had the evidence that would end the trial. Political observers watching from home would later say they noticed it too. A certain energy that suggested Crockett hadn't come to play defense. She had come prepared for a fight. The segment began like any other. Maddow welcomed her guest, smiled just enough to mask the sharpness beneath, and launched directly into her first question. Her voice carried that signature authority, steady and deliberate, the kind that put most guests immediately on their heels. Congresswoman Crockett, she began. There's been a lot of talk about whether progressive Democrats are hurting the party's chances in upcoming elections. Polling suggests that policies like Medicare for All or defunding the police don't play well with moderate voters. What do you say to Democrats who are worried that this kind of rhetoric is handing victories to Republicans? It was a classic. Maddow move framed the question in a way that assumes the answer is already unfavorable, forcing the guests to scramble for defense. Most politicians would have immediately tried to soften their stance, pivot, or deflect. But Crockett only smiled, a knowing kind of smile, and leaned forward slightly. Rachel, she said calmly, I think it's interesting how you framed that question. But before we talk about polling, maybe we should talk about results, because the numbers I'm looking at tell a very different story. The response was subtle, but devastating. Instead of stepping into Maddow's frame, Crockett dismantled it. She refused to accept the premise, and in doing so, she shifted the entire dynamic. You could almost see Maddow blink in surprise. For the first time that night, the queen of liberal media had been checked. Maddow tried again, more pointed this time. She shuffled through her notes, the sound of papers shivering under her fingers. But Congresswoman, when we look at places like Virginia and New Jersey, Democrats have struggled, and many analysts blame progressive messaging. Isn't it irresponsible to keep pushing these positions when the data shows they're costing elections? The word irresponsible hung in the air like a gauntlet being thrown. Maddow was confident it would corner her guest, but Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes sharpened, and her voice carried a new edge, the voice of a lawyer about to tear apart a hostile witness. Rachel, she said, her tone still calm but layered with steel, I find it fascinating that you're lecturing me about responsibility when the evidence tells another story. In my district in Texas, of all places I won by running, on Medicare for All, affordable housing, and criminal justice reform, and I didn't just win. I energized voters who had given up on politics. That's not irresponsibility. That's what democracy looks like. The silence that followed was electric. For a split second, Maddow's confidence faltered. Her trademark, smirk wavered. Her composure cracked just enough for cameras to catch it. She wasn't used to guests pushing back this hard this early. This wasn't a defensive scramble. This was an offensive strike. Behind the cameras, producers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected fireworks, yes, but controlled fireworks. Maddow in command, Crockett reacting. Instead, Crockett was flipping the script entirely. Determined to regain control, Maddow doubled down. She raised her voice just slightly enough to sound authoritative and pulled a page from her notes as though revealing damning evidence. But Congresswoman, winning in a gerrymandered Texas district is very different from winning swing states. Don't you think it's reckless to push? Policies polling clearly shows are unpopular with suburban voters. Isn't it your responsibility to help the party win? Not just make speeches that sound good? There it was again, the word responsibility. This time delivered with sharpened precision, meant to cut through Crockett's composure. But Crockett only leaned in further. Rachel, she said slowly, almost deliberately, let me ask you something. When was the last time you had to choose between paying for prescription drugs and paying rent? When was the last time you had to decide between groceries and a medical bill? The question hit like a thunderclap. Maddow froze for half a beat. Too long. I don't think my personal circumstances are relevant, she began, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Oh, but they absolutely are, Crockett cut in, her voice rising now with passion. Because you're sitting in a multi-million-dollar studio, making millions yourself, telling working families they should settle for less. You're saying that wanting healthcare is irresponsible, that wanting a livable planet is too radical? And frankly, Rachel, that says more about you than it does about the voters you claim to understand. The studio felt different now, charged with a kind of raw, uncomfortable energy. Maddow's legendary dominance over her guests was slipping away, piece by piece, under Crockett's relentless pressure. And that was only the beginning. Maddow's face hardened. She straightened her posture, the kind of subtle adjustment seasoned. Anchors make when they feel their grip slipping but don't want the audience to notice. Still, the flicker of discomfort had already been caught on camera, and Crockett was just warming up. Rachel tried to pivot, a classic move to reframe the narrative. She leaned on the safe ground of data and analysis, her comfort zone. Congresswoman, with all due respect, I'm not dismissing the struggles of everyday Americans. But the political reality is that elections are won in the middle. Moderates, independents, they're the ones who decide who controls Congress and the White House. And when the rhetoric becomes too extreme, it alienates them. That's not opinion, that's political science. It was the kind of line Maddow's audience usually cheered for. The pragmatism, the appeal to reason, the positioning of progressives as passionate but impractical. Except tonight Crockett wasn't playing the role Maddow expected. She wasn't nodding politely or stumbling into defensive justification. Instead, her response came fast, sharp, and utterly unflinching. Da-da-da-da. Rachel, I was a lawyer before I was a congresswoman. And in a courtroom, if someone presents evidence, I don't just accept it because it sounds good. I examine the credibility. I check the source. So when you cite political science, I have to ask, whose science? Which polls? Because when I look at the data, I see something very different. I see overwhelming support for raising the minimum wage. I see majority support for universal health care. I see young people demanding climate action at historic levels. It's not fringe. That's the majority of this country. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maddow pressed her lips together, flipping through her papers as if searching for a rebuttal. But Crockett wasn't finished. And let's be real, she continued, her voice now filled with conviction, the so-called middle you're talking about, it's not some static group of voters living in suburbia, frozen in time. It's dynamic. It shifts. It evolves. 10 years ago, marriage equality was controversial. Today, it's mainstream. Why? Because people fought for it unapologetically. Because leaders didn't back down just because a pollster said it wasn't popular enough yet. That's how progress happens, not by watering down the truth, but by telling it boldly and letting the people catch up. The audience at home felt it. Social media would later erupt with clips of this exact moment. shared with captions like Jasmine Crockett schooling Maddow on live TV, and this is how you clap back with facts. Maddow's jaw tightened. She tried to move the conversation forward, but the rhythm was gone. For the first time, she looked like she was following rather than leading. "Congresswoman," she said, her tone measured but strained. "There's a difference between inspiring rhetoric and winning elections. The hard truth is that Republicans are laser-focused on power. And while progressives talk about revolution, conservatives are quietly organizing. Flipping school boards, state legislatures, and courts. Doesn't your approach risk handing them even more victories?" Crockett tilted her head, almost as if amused. "You mean to tell me Republicans are winning because Democrats are too bold?" "No, Rachel. No. They're winning because Democrats are too timid. Because while Republicans fight tooth and nail for their vision, no matter how extreme, too many Democrats are busy telling voters what they can't have. That's not strategy. That's surrender." The word landed like a hammer. Surrender. Maddow blinked, visibly caught off guard. Her show was built on dissecting Republican tactics and holding them to account. Yet here was Crockett accusing Democrats, her own party, of something far worse: cowardice. "You call it boldness?" Crockett went on, her voice rising with passion. "I call it survival. People are drowning under medical debt. They're working 3 jobs and still can't pay rent. They're watching their communities flood and burn because of climate change. And you want me to tell them to wait? To compromise? To settle for half measures while billionaires and corporations write the laws? That's not moderation, Rachel. It's betrayal." For a split second, the studio was silent. Even Maddow, known for her quick pivots and sharp comebacks, was frozen, her lips parted as if to reply, but no words came out. The cameras captured it, the rare sight of Rachel Maddow speechless on her own show.
Oh.
Crockett leaned in, her voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "You know what's truly irresponsible? Telling people their lives are negotiable? Acting like their pain is just a political calculation? That's not what leadership is supposed to be. Leadership is about courage. If we don't have the courage to fight for what's right, then what are we even doing here?" It was the kind of line that would be replayed again and again, clipped and shared across every social platform. TikTok edits layered with dramatic music, Twitter threads, dissecting each word. It wasn't just a response, it was a statement of philosophy, a challenge not just to Maddow, but to the entire Democratic establishment. Maddow tried to recover, but the more she spoke, the more it seemed like she was chasing the conversation, rather than controlling it. She repeated her points about pragmatism, about incrementalism, about the risks of overreach. But each time, Crockett met her with fire and clarity, dismantling every argument and flipping it on its head. By the midpoint of the interview, the power dynamic had fully shifted. Maddow, usually the conductor of these exchanges, was visibly straining, her hand tapping the desk, her papers shuffled nervously. Crockett, meanwhile, grew stronger with each exchange, her confidence radiating through the screen. Viewers at home felt it too. Twitter hashtags began trending even before the segment ended. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag MADDOW meltdown. Hashtag Jasmine unleashed. Clips went viral in real time, racking up millions of views before the show even wrapped. While Maddow might have walked into the studio expecting a segment she controlled, what she got instead was a masterclass in political combat, one where she was no longer the teacher, but the student. But Crockett wasn't done. She had one more point to drive home, and when it landed, it would shake not just the studio, but the entire political media landscape. Crockett adjusted her microphone, leaned back slightly, and let the silence linger. It was deliberate. She knew the weight of the moment. She allowed the pause to stretch just long enough for viewers to lean in closer, waiting for what came next. Then she delivered it calm, sharp, and devastating. You know what the problem is, Rachel? Too many Democrats want credit for fighting without ever throwing a punch. They want the praise that comes with calling themselves defenders of democracy. But when the moment comes to actually defend it, they fold. They say, "Oh, the voters aren't ready. The time isn't right. We'll get there eventually." But here's the truth. People don't have the luxury of waiting for politicians to grow a spine. Maddow blinked, her fingers twitching as they shuffled her notes again. She'd been here before, faced with a guest who took control, but rarely to this degree. Usually she could redirect with a clever question or an authoritative fact. But Crockett wasn't a typical guest. She wasn't here to play along. Let me give you an example, Crockett continued, her tone shifting from critique to storytelling, the kind that pulled viewers deeper. Last month I met a woman in my district, a single mom of 2. She works 60 hours a week at a grocery store. She's exhausted, she's stressed, and she's terrified every time her kids get sick because she doesn't have health insurance. You think she cares about whether my policies are too progressive? No. She cares about whether her kids live or die. That's the reality, Rachel. That's the urgency. It was raw, emotional, and impossible to dismiss. Maddow, who prided herself on intellectual rigor, suddenly looked like she was standing on quicksand. The debate about ideology had turned into a moral reckoning, one that Crockett was winning. Not just with logic, but with heart. Maddow tried to regain her footing. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if to reclaim control. Congresswoman, I don't doubt your sincerity or the urgency of the issues you raise, but politics isn't just about passion. It's about building coalitions, about compromise. If you push too hard, you risk alienating allies you need to. Pass any of these reforms. Isn't incremental progress better than no progress at all? It was a familiar argument, one Maddow had made countless times, to countless guests. But Crockett's response was immediate, fierce, and unforgettable. Incremental progress? She shot back. Tell that to the family choosing between rent and insulin. Tell that to the community watching wildfires swallow their homes. Tell that to the teenager crushed under student debt before they even get their first real job. Rachel, incrementalism is a luxury for people whose lives aren't on the line. For everyone else, it's a death sentence. And I refuse to look my constituents in the eye and tell them to wait their turn while billionaires buy yachts with the money stolen from their labor. The words sliced through the studio like a blade. Maddow flinched ever so slightly, but the cameras caught it, the involuntary reaction of someone who'd been hit harder than expected. By now, the energy in the room had shifted completely. Producers behind the glass exchanged wide-eyed glances, recognizing they were witnessing television history. Crockett wasn't just holding her own. She was rewriting the rules of engagement. And then came the moment that sealed it. Maddow, perhaps desperate to regain control, reached for what she thought was solid ground. She referenced history. Look, Congresswoman, great movements in American politics, civil rights, women's suffrage, marriage equality, they all required patience. They didn't happen overnight. Isn't it naive to think we can just snap our fingers and transform the system? It was meant to be a trump card, the kind of argument that usually closed a conversation. But Crockett was ready. Patience, she repeated, almost incredulous. Civil rights didn't come from patience. They came from protest. From disruption. From people who risked their lives because they couldn't wait any longer. Dr. King didn't write a letter from a Birmingham jail saying, "Take your time, oppressors. We'll wait until you're comfortable with equality." He said, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied." You know that. Everyone knows that. Don't rewrite history to justify inaction. Maddow froze. The camera zoomed in, catching her eyes flicker, the look of someone realizing she'd walked right into a rhetorical trap. Crockett's words echoed with the kind of clarity that made the air itself feel heavy. And Crockett pressed on her, voice steady, her delivery almost surgical. Progress doesn't happen because politicians beg for crumbs and hope the powerful are feeling generous. Progress happens when ordinary people demand what they deserve, and leaders have the guts to stand with them, not lecture them about being too loud. So if being unapologetic makes me naive in your eyes, so be it. I'd rather be naive and fight for justice than be cynical and settle for injustice. The audience at home erupted, not in literal applause, but in living rooms, on couches. In the rapid fire of tweets and TikToks being posted in real time, hashtags exploded. Hashtag justice denied. Hashtag Crockett V's. MADDOW. Hashtag speak truth to power. And in the studio, Rachel Maddow's composure cracked, if only for a second. She pursed her lips, took a deep breath, and adjusted her glasses. It was her tell, the subtle sign that she knew she'd lost the exchange. Crockett, meanwhile, leaned forward again, her eyes locked on Maddow's. You asked me earlier if I'm worried about alienating moderates. Let me tell you what I'm worried about. I'm worried about alienating the people who put their faith in us, the ones who keep showing up to vote, to march, to fight, only to be told by their leaders that their dreams are unrealistic. That's what kills movements, not boldness, not passion, but betrayal by the very people who claim to represent them. The words landed like thunder. Maddow tried to interject, but Crockett wasn't finished. And you know what else? The so-called moderates you're worried about? They respect conviction. They may not agree with everything I say, but they know I mean it. And deep down, people trust authenticity more than they trust polished talking points. That's why Republicans, as wrong as they are, still hold power because they project conviction, even when their convictions are rotten. Imagine if Democrats projected the same strength, but with policies that actually uplift people. Imagine. The movement we could build. The studio lights seemed brighter now, the tension thicker, the clash bigger than just two women on opposite sides of a desk. This was no longer just an interview. It was a battle over the soul of a party, a showdown between establishment caution and insurgent courage. And in that moment, it was clear. Crockett wasn't just holding her ground. She was winning. Maddow inhaled slowly, searching for a thread she could grasp to bring the conversation back under her control. Her eyes darted to the teleprompter, but the scripted notes suddenly felt useless. This was no ordinary exchange. She was locked in a duel with someone who wasn't just debating policy, but reshaping the narrative in real time. She tried a different angle. Congresswoman, I think what's getting lost here is that I agree with many of your priorities. Healthcare, climate, education, these matter deeply. But my concern, and frankly the concern of many watching tonight, is whether demanding everything at once risks getting nothing. Do you worry that your approach could backfire and empower the very forces you're fighting against? It was a clever pivot, reframing herself as an ally, not an adversary. Maddow's voice softened, her cadence more measured, as if trying to gently guide Crockett back into safer territory. But Crockett wasn't fooled. No, Rachel, she said firmly. What risks empowering the forces we're fighting against is fear. Fear of losing, fear of offending, fear of asking for too much. That fear has paralyzed this party for decades, and the result is a country where billionaires have more power than Congress, where corporations write the laws, and where ordinary people are left begging for scraps. If we don't demand everything, we won't get anything. That's the backfire you should be worried about. Maddow pressed her lips together, her silence betraying the sting of Crockett's words. Crockett leaned in, her tone sharpening with each sentence. Think about it. Republicans never start negotiations by asking for less. They demand the extreme, the outrageous, the unthinkable, and then they drag the center toward them. Democrats, we start by negotiating against ourselves. We say, here's the compromise we think you'll accept. And then we wonder why the center keeps shifting further and further right. Rachel, that's not pragmatism. That's surrender dressed up as strategy. The audience at home could feel it, the fire in her words, the conviction dripping from every syllable. Social media was already ablaze, with clips circulating before the segment even ended. Maddow attempted to interject again. But Congresswoman, surely you recognize that politics is the art of the possible. Isn't there a danger in setting expectations so high that people become disillusioned when change doesn't come immediately? It was another tried-and-true establishment defense, one that usually landed. But Crockett had anticipated it. Disillusioned. She repeated, shaking her head, Rachel, people are already disillusioned. That's why voter turnout is collapsing. That's why faith in institutions is at an all-time low. You think lowering expectations inspires people? No, it drains them, tells them their dreams aren't worth fighting for. You know what inspires people? Belief, vision, the promise that tomorrow can actually look different from today. That's how movements are built, not by managing disappointment, but by daring to hope. The words hung heavy in the air, resonating beyond the studio walls. Maddow's face betrayed the slightest flicker of recognition that she was not simply interviewing a guest, but witnessing the rise of a new political force, one that thrived on truth spoken without apology. And Crockett wasn't finished. "You see, Rachel, the art of the possible doesn't mean accepting the crumbs. It means expanding what's possible. Every major advance in this country, every single one, happened because people refused to accept the limits handed to them. The abolition of slavery, the 8-hour workday, the Civil Rights Act, none of those things were possible until movements made them possible. So when you tell me to be realistic, what I hear is, stay small, stay quiet, stay manageable, and I refuse." Maddow's jaw tightened. She straightened her papers, buying herself a moment, but the audience could see it. She was on the defensive, and Crockett wasn't letting go. For a fleeting second, Maddow tried to change the subject entirely, steering into safer territory. "Let's talk about foreign policy," she began, but Crockett cut her off with a calm, surgical precision that stunned even her. "No, Rachel. Let's finish this conversation, because this isn't about policy details. This is about political will. It's about courage. And the truth is, too many people with power are more afraid of controversy than they are of injustice. And that's why we're stuck." The control shift was undeniable. Maddow, one of television's most respected interviewers, was no longer leading. She was being led. Then Crockett delivered the line that would dominate headlines. The one that would replay endlessly across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube clips. "You asked me if I worry about alienating moderates. Here's my answer. I worry about alienating history. Because when my grandchildren look back on this moment, I don't want them to say, 'She had the chance to fight, and she chose to wait.' I want them to say, 'She refused to wait.' That's the legacy I'm chasing. Not approval, not comfort, justice." The words landed like a gavel, final, irrefutable. Maddow exhaled audibly, her attempt to mask frustration betrayed by the microphone. She adjusted her glasses again, her familiar tell, but this time the gesture carried the weight of defeat. Crockett sat back, her eyes unwavering, her posture relaxed as if to signal she had nothing left to prove. The damage was done. The shift was complete. And in living rooms across America, viewers knew they had just witnessed a rare moment in politics. Authenticity, triumphing over caution, conviction over calculation. Clips of the exchange shot through the internet like wildfire. Headlines framed it as a generational clash, a defining showdown between bold progressivism and establishment moderation. Supporters of Crockett declared it a victory not just for her, but for the movement she represented. Critics of Maddow whispered that for the first time in her career, she'd been truly outmatched. The cameras kept rolling, but the battle had already been decided. Crockett had done what few had ever managed. She had silenced Rachel Maddow. The tension in the studio was electric. Producers behind the cameras exchanged glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the segment ride. Maddow's team was used to control, carefully managed pacing, calculated pivots, an anchor always one step ahead. But tonight, the script had been torn apart, and everyone could feel it. Rachel inhaled deeply, her voice softer now, almost measured in defeat. "Congresswoman, I'll admit your passion is undeniable. But don't you worry that framing politics in this way, as a battle between the timid and the brave, creates divisions within the very party you claim to fight for?" It was a plea, a final attempt to claw back some semblance of authority. Yet Crockett's eyes didn't waver. She waited a beat, letting the silence build, then delivered the answer that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. "Rachel, division doesn't come from telling the truth. Division comes from pretending the truth doesn't exist. It comes from silencing people who are hurting, from calling their pain too extreme to acknowledge. If that makes me divisive, so be it. Because I'd rather divide the powerful than betray the powerless." The words hit like thunder. Maddow blinked, her usual arsenal of quick retorts suddenly absent. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and for the first time in years, the MSNBC titan looked smaller than the guest sitting across from her. Crockett leaned forward, her tone dropping lower, more intimate, the kind of delivery that forces audiences to lean in. "And let's be real, Rachel. People aren't tuning into politics because they want more spin, more caution, more maybe next time. They're tuning out because they're tired of being lied to. Crave is honesty. Raw, unpolished honesty. And if the Democratic Party can't give them that, someone else will. That's the risk. Maddow sat frozen. The control, the gravitas, the polished rhythm that had made her a staple of primetime television gone. In its place was a journalist visibly rattled, grappling with a guest who had not only challenged her framing but dismantled it in front of millions. The segment could have ended there. It would have already been one for the history books. But Crockett, sensing the opportunity, had one final message to deliver. She raised her chin slightly, her voice steady but commanding. You asked me earlier if I worry about alienating voters. Here's the truth. The only voters I worry about alienating are the ones who've already given up on the system. Because they're not apathetic, they're exhausted. And when they see politicians dodging, hedging, compromising away their futures, they don't see leaders. They see gatekeepers. I didn't come to Washington to be a gatekeeper. I came to kick the damn gate open. The room fell silent. Even the producers stopped moving. Maddow's eyes widened. A mix of awe, shock, and disbelief was the kind of line that didn't just end an interview, it defined it. And at that moment, millions of viewers across the country leaned forward in their living room, feeling something they hadn't felt from politics in years: fire. When the show finally cut to commercial, Maddow leaned back in her chair, visibly shaken. She adjusted her glasses again, not to signal confidence this time, but to mask discomfort. Crockett, meanwhile, sat calm, collected, almost serene. She had said what she came to say, and she knew it had landed. The clip spread online like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags were trending across platforms. Hashtag GatekeeperVs, Gate Opener, hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag MADDOW moment. Twitter threads dissected every exchange. TikTok flooded with edits, dramatic captions overlaying Crockett's most fiery lines. On YouTube, the clip was re-uploaded by dozens of political commentators, each calling it a turning point. Headlines followed the next morning. Rachel Maddow left speechless by Jasmine Crockett's fiery defense of progressivism. Crockett, Viz Motto, the interview that shook MSNBC. A new progressive star rises in viral TV showdown. Even critics admitted it. Crockett had done what few ever dared. She had taken on Maddow on her own turf and walked away not just unscathed, but elevated. In political circles, the whispers began almost immediately. Some strategists called it reckless, others called it genius. But no one denied it. Jasmine Crockett had arrived as a force to be reckoned with, a voice that couldn't be ignored, a leader who refused to wait her turn. And for Rachel Maddow, the night would be remembered as the rare moment she lost control not to a Republican challenger, not to a hostile guest, but to a rising Democrat who represented the very movement her brand of caution had tried to contain. History would mark it as a shift, a passing of the torch, whether intentional or not, a moment when television's most powerful anchor met the unstoppable momentum of unapologetic progressivism and blinked. The gate, as Crockett said, had been kicked open, and there was no closing it again. By the time the credits rolled that night, the internet was already writing its own narrative. Viewers clipped their favorite exchanges, commentators rushed to upload instant reaction videos, and memes began circulating at light speed. Crockett's line, "I didn't come to Washington to be a gatekeeper. I came to kick the damn gate open," had already been etched into the digital bloodstream, destined to live forever in political highlight reels. But the true weight of the moment wasn't measured in trending hashtags. It was measured in the conversations it sparked across the country. In coffee shops the next morning, ordinary people who hadn't watched cable news in years suddenly found themselves debating Crockett's words. On college campuses, students replayed the clip in dorm rooms, dissecting every retort, every pause, every fiery declaration. In union halls, her voice echoed through speakers, played on loop as a rallying cry. And in Washington, the effect was seismic. Her colleagues, some supportive, others skeptical, scrambled to process what had just happened. Progressives cheered, seeing in Crockett the embodiment of a movement too often dismissed as naive. Centrists whispered warnings, worried she had set expectations too high. But one thing was certain: nobody could ignore her anymore. Rachel Maddow, for her part, addressed the interview with her trademark composure on her next broadcast. She framed it as a spirited exchange of ideas, carefully sidestepping any admission of being rattled. But sharpened viewers could see it in her eyes, a flicker of humility, an unspoken acknowledgement that the tide was shifting. Because Maddow understood something few dared to say out loud: the audience wasn't just watching the exchange, they were choosing sides. And for many, Crockett's fire was exactly what they'd been waiting for. Political historians would later compare the moment to other iconoclashes: Kennedy versus Nixon, Sanders versus Clinton, Ocasio-Cortez versus the establishment machine. But in real time, it felt different. It wasn't just a debate about policies. It was a battle over the soul of the party, a question of whether Democrats would continue to move cautiously within old boundaries, whether they would dare to leap beyond them. Crockett had drawn a line in the sand, and she hadn't just crossed it, she'd obliterated it. In the weeks that followed, her profile skyrocketed. Invitations to speak poured in. Grassroots donations surged. Volunteers signed up in record numbers. Every rally she attended carried the same refrain from the crowd: "Kick the gate open." It had become more than a slogan. It was a mission. Meanwhile, Maddow's interview entered the cultural canon of viral political moments. Clips of her adjusting her glasses, of her searching for words, of her stunned silence, they were analyzed and reanalyzed. Proof of the rare occasion when America's most unflappable interviewer was, for once, flapped. It wasn't a story about Maddow losing. It was a story about Crockett winning, about a newcomer daring to defy the unwritten rules of deference and restraint. It's about a politician refusing to wait her turn in a system that thrives on waiting. It was about the moment when a spark caught fire on national television. And like every spark that grows into a blaze, it didn't just light up one room, it spread. 2 voters who felt invisible, 2 activists who felt unheard, 2 communities who had been told again and again to wait. The clash wasn't just an interview. It was a mirror reflecting back to America the tension between caution and courage, compromise and conviction, patience and urgency. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: the people who change the world are never the ones who wait quietly in line. They're the ones who speak when silence is expected, who fight when surrender is convenient, who dare when fear says otherwise. That night, Jasmine Crockett showed America exactly which kind of leader she was, and millions were ready to follow.